Hello and welcome. I am Shushai Adane and you are watching Arma Media. Today I am honored to sit down once again with Professor Shetel Tromvel, one of the leading experts on the Horn of Africa. In our previous conversation, we explored quite key dynamics shaping the region, and today we continue that dialogue to unpack new developments. Stay with us. Welcome to the program once again, Professor.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Sushay.
Thank you. As you know, the region is in a very critical juncture, simply to say. So I prefer to start with this current issue. During the genocidal war on Tigray, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed had repeatedly denied the presence of Eritrean forces inside the region, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Later, as you also know, in a parliamentary session, he openly expressed gratitude to the Eritrean government and its troops for their support during the genocidal war. Following the signing of the Pretoria Agreement in November 2022, which directly requires the withdrawal of foreign forces from Ethiopian territory, he shifted his stance or stand again, insisting that Eritrean forces were confined to their own territory under the terms of the Algiers agreement following the Ethiopia-Eritrea bloody war. However, most recently, he has accused Eritrea of occupying Ethiopian land and supporting armed groups inside Ethiopia. So his government has demanded Eritrea or Eritrea's immediate withdrawal and has begun mobilizing troops along the border to cleanse the country or the Ethiopian territory of Eritrean forces. So the very question that I would like to ask you just to start with is, how do you interpret Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's repeated reversals regarding Eritrean involvement in Tigray, from denial to acknowledgement to dismissal and now outright accusation? So, what does this reveal about his political strategy and credibility? Is the first question that I prefer to start with, Professor.
Thank you. I think you also forgot to mention that most recently he also accused the Eritrean troops to be the perpetrators of the massacres in Aksum and elsewhere in Tigray, that the main perpetrators of the genocidal violence he attributed to Eritrean troops. And then subsequently, as you mentioned, accuse them of now being on Ethiopian territory in northern parts of the country in Tigray. I think what you have outlined, the various position of the Prime Minister and hence the federal government of Ethiopia, is a reflection on the political dynamics and the political alliance the Ethiopian government had with the Eritrean government from before the war on Tigray, during the war on Tigray, and then after the signing of the Pretoria Agreement. We know that close security political alliance between Asmara and Addis waned, and it deteriorated the relationship, and then more recently turned into a hostile bilateral relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So again, the various statements of as Abiy Ahmed and Ethiopia has formulated Eritrea's engagement in Tigray during this time period reflects only the political alliance and the breakdown of that alliance. It's a tactical posture, you can say, from the Prime Minister to earlier justify or legitimate the war on Tigray, and today to then blame the atrocities, at least most of the atrocities, on the new enemy, Eritrea. And again, to position then Eritrea as a hostile neighbor to Ethiopia, to justify and legitimate a right of self-defense for Ethiopia, if it is true, as it appears to be. I must say, several sources are corroborating that Eritrean troops are on Ethiopian soil in the north, in Tigray. Hence, the federal government will then, according to international law, proclaim a right of self-defense to eject foreign troops, hostile troops on Ethiopian territory.
Part of my question was what consequences all this do you think would have in his credibility in the country as a prime minister?
Well, I think maybe you are better to answer that. You are an Ethiopian citizen, I'm not. It is up to every Ethiopian to evaluate the credibility of its government, as it is for my government in Norway. And we are getting used to politicians both in Europe and in Africa not telling the truth to its citizens, so to say. So, well, that's up to every Ethiopian to evaluate the credibility of the prime minister in this regard.
Okay. One more related question is in his February 2026 or last month, in other words, address to Ethiopia's House of People's Representatives, the Prime Minister has also asserted that Ethiopia's quarrel with Eritrea did not stem uh, from disputes over the Red Sea or the port of Assab. Instead, the confrontation began during the Tigray War, when Eritrean forces entered to the cities of Shire and Adigrat and engaged in looting and destruction. Abiy told the parliament that he personally confronted President Isaias at the time, demanding that he stop committing such acts against my people. In other words, the people of Tigray, Professor. So, according to Abiy, this marked the beginning of Ethiopia's conflict with Eritrea, not Ethiopia's long-standing aspiration for the port of Assab or port access simply. So the question here is, how do you also interpret this bold statement or claim, given that Tigrayans have, as you know, accused Abiy Ahmed himself of genocide? So is this an attempt to recast his image as a defender of Tigrayans, or does it reflect a deeper political strategy to shift blame onto Eritrea? Yeah, I would like to know your insights about this.
Yes, I observed that statement from the Prime Minister in the House of Representatives. I also saw that he said that at that time he sent Gedu, who was then stepping down as the foreign minister, to Asmara as an envoy to communicate that message. But I've also seen that Mr. Gedu later has rejected that claim and said he was not sent there to chastise and criticize Eritrean atrocities in Tigray, rather the opposite, as an envoy from the Ethiopian government. And this is word against word from two top politicians, so to say, in the regime at that time. I think from my point of view, the relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia deteriorated by the signing of the Pretoria Agreement. Already at that time, I said clearly that Eritrea was not satisfied with the Pretoria Agreement. They were not happy with that ending of the war in Tigray. They had not fulfilled, or Isaias had not fulfilled his objective at that time to annihilate and crush TPLF once and for all. and the Pretoria Agreement left the front still standing, so to say, TPLF, the leadership. Just a very few individuals at the top level leadership were killed in the war. The rest were intact. The structure of the party were intact, and that was the grievances expressed from Eritrea at that time against the Pretoria Agreement, and hence from that day and onwards, November 2022, we have seen a steady decline and deterioration of the relationship. I think that was the key turning point. And then later, Ethiopian government's pursuit of sea access to the Red Sea in particular, and claim of Assab aggravated that the response from Asmara even further, which kind of tell the tale, so to say, of the situation today. Yes, I believe, you know, any political leader is rewriting the history so it fits his or her current standing and policies. And this is an example in that regard, that the various actors are reinterpreting and rewriting the very recent history on the atrocities happening in Tigray.
But to what extent do you think that speech can make a difference with regard to the attitude of the people of Tigray, just based on your experience and observation?
Again, you are better to answer your own questions, my friend, than I am. I think I believe that the people of Tigray, during their very turbulent relationship to political elites, both in Addis, in Mekele, and elsewhere, for the last number of years, I believe all people in Tigray should question political authority, be that in Addis or in Mekele, and question statements and explanations offered to them, as they are apparently always suffering from political decisions made in Addis or in Mekele. So I think it doesn't increase the trust, so to say, to the political leadership, the way the current debate is handled.
Thank you. Let me proceed to questions related to military mobilization and strategic intent, which is a burning issue, as you might have seen from different media outlets. Jawar Mohammed, on his Facebook account yesterday, I think it was yesterday, argued that the extraordinary deployment of Ethiopian National Defense Forces to the north at levels not seen since the 1998 to 2000 or 2000 war, that signals Abiy Ahmed has little choice but to initiate conflict. Do you agree with this assessment, Professor, or do you see any other alternative or explanations for such large-scale deployment or mobilization of troops, in other words?
Yes, I've also seen many reports of massive mobilization of ENDF, Ethiopian troops, and also then redeployment to the north through various media and reports. We hear that. If it is on the scale of the 1998-2000 war against Eritrea, I cannot tell. That was a full national mobilization across Ethiopia towards an enemy country. This is not, we are not there yet, neither a war on Eritrea or on Tigray. I think, of course, a new war can always be avoided until the first shot is fired. And also after that, for that matter, when it comes to mitigating negotiations. It does seem, however, that the path to negotiation is more or less, is extremely narrow. and the road towards war is more wide open, to use that framing. When you do mobilize the huge military resources, which Ethiopia apparently are doing, that in itself creates a dynamic. And I can see that that's possibly what Jawar is indicating, that you kind of get a self-fulfilling prophecy, so to say. I sincerely hope not. I sincerely hope there might be a way out of this in terms of negotiations with Mekele. You yourself the other day, sent out a message that the federal government had asked TIRA, the interim administration of Tigray, for free access through Tigray in order to defend the northern border to Eritrea. I don't know, I haven't seen that officially confirmed in any statement. I don't know if it is so, but you know, from that perspective, if that is the intention of the federal government to send troops to the north to defend their border against Eritrea, it should not necessarily involve a war on Tigray or on the government of Tigray. That's a clear statement then that the enemy is your neighbor, and hence, according to both international law and the Ethiopian constitution, it is the sovereign prerogative of the federal government to defend the territory of Ethiopia. And if they believe that Ethiopian territory is threatened and incurs by Eritrea, well, then, according to that perspective, they should mobilize in order to push out the Eritrean troops they allege being in Tigray.
Okay. As you might have seen, my post also has clearly indicated information is not yet confirmed, just like you said. Yeah. So, what do you think Abiy is relentlessly working to accomplish around the north, deploying this much or this number of troops or moving his troops towards this or to the place where I am found right now? Do you think his very mission to accomplish is to cleanse the Ethiopian territory from Eritrean troops, just like you said now? Is that really genuine? Yeah, I'm asking you intentionally because you are from among the leading experts or analysts around all of the Horn region. So, what do you think is the very mission he is relentlessly working to accomplish around this or around the north? Do you think it is to fight against Eritrea to realize his mission or Ethiopia's claim to regain Assab, or to really cleanse Ethiopia from Eritrean troops, or second round genocide against the people of Tigray or TPLF?
Well, it is an expression that one can kill two birds with one stone, which might be appropriate in this context. I'm not saying that is the truth, but it might be interpreted like that. The mobilization against Eritrea is justified if Eritrean troops are on Ethiopian territory. And there are strong indications, not only indication, but proofs that that is correct. And that differs from the situation in 2020, when the federal government invited Eritrean troops to join in on the war against Tigray. At that time, the Tigray war was not considered an internationalized war because Eritrea was an ally of the sovereign government of Ethiopia. Today, Eritrea is portrayed as a hostile state versus Ethiopian interests, both domestically, but also in terms of the regional aspects of it. So it will be an internationalized war if that breaks out. And to tick off the first element, that yes, I believe it is right for a sovereign government to defend its territory if that is encroached by an enemy state. Then you have an added element, that is this also about access to Assab and to the Red Sea, which you might speculate on, considering all the statements we have seen from Ethiopian officials and senior political elites over the last 2 years. That might be so too. And if that is correct, then it is not only a war to push out Eritrean troops on Ethiopian soil, it will be a regime change war in Eritrea, which is the objective, because Ethiopia will never get access or permanent control of Assab with Isaias in power in Asmara. So we need to change the government to get a more friendly government, to use that term, or to get a transition in Eritrea, which might facilitate an agreement on Assab with Addis Ababa. But then you have a third element packed into this, and that's obviously the Addis Mekele dimension, which again is linked to what appears to be then the Tsimdo, the alliance, the new security political alliance between Asmara and Mekele, which is, there has been a lot of speculations on how deep that alliance is and what are the strategic interest of Tsimdo, not only the tactical interest. The tactical interest seems quite obvious, that both Mekele and Asmara are against Addis Ababa. But what are the strategic objectives of such an alliance, which is much more ambiguous, which hasn't been spelled out by either party, neither Mekele or Asmara, which obviously makes the federal government nervous, that you do have then a sub-regional government which should be loyal, or should at least be adhering to policies the federal government decides when it comes to international relations and security, which are the prerogative of the federal government, not the regional government. So when the regional government breaks that trust, so to say, and allies with an explicitly mentioned hostile state, it might come natural that a war between Ethiopia then and Eritrea will also be a regime change war in Mekele, to use that term, since the Mekele administration has proven not to be adhering to the constitutional principles the federal government are arguing. This is not my, I'm not speaking now as Kjetil, my personal opinion. I'm just observing and analyzing these three dimensions of the conflict we are about to enter into. The interlinkage, so to say, between then an Ethiopia-Eritrea war and a possible Addis Mekele conflict. It is interlinked. And I don't think you will have one without the other. That is the, at least as the situation is today. If you don't get a much clearer statements from Tira, I've seen recent statements from TPLF and Debretsion, very much advocating peace and negotiations, calling for international attention to the issue, calling for AU to step in to really enforce both the Pretoria Agreement, but also mitigating efforts to stop a possible civil war on Tigray once again. But in those statements are also clear articulation of Tigrayan prerogatives, so to say, or Tigrayan self-determination rights, and a very, very deep skepticism versus the federal government. That is in the official statements of TPLF, which again is not TIRA. And what the interim government is deciding is the formal correct status position of Tigray, not what TPLF is deciding. But obviously, we all know who calls the shots in Mekelle. So I think, all sides here, both Asmara, Mekelle, and Addis Ababa, are very skilled in what diplomats call constructive ambiguity. The statements can be interpreted in many different ways, both as an argument for negotiations and peaceful settlement, but also as a deterrence strategy, and surely also as a direct threat of military interventions. And so everyone are hedging their bets, so to say, arguing, yes, we are happy to have negotiations, but negotiations on our terms, possibly. And if we don't get that through, well, then we are ready for war, so to say. But the key, you can say, the key decision maker on this, in this broader war theater, is actually Mekelle, in the sense, which way do you go? And that's a very, very serious position, which rests with the political leadership in Mekelle.
Professor, which way do you think is right to go for Mekelle? Just as a recommendation, it's okay. Huh?
No, I will not answer that directly, my friend. I don't think. I just see it as an extremely difficult position. I will not give any recommendations on either to TIRA or TPLF or to the Tigrayan people. They have to, you have to make up your own opinion on that, so to say. There are arguments, valid historical, political, ethnographic arguments, which can justify both positions, so to say.
What to impact, yeah.
Both aligning with going against Addis or going with Addis.
Okay, but Professor, you told me that Dr. Debretsion has recently written a letter to the international community, including the African Union, with regard to implementing Pretoria Agreement. As to you, that letter promotes peace, right? But at the same time, you said self-determination. Don't you think so? That is constitutional right to any Ethiopian, which is clearly stated in the constitution. What's wrong with that point of Debretsion in that letter to the international community? Why does that make the federal government to be suspicious with Tigray? That's the point.
Well, yes, you do have the right to self-determination according to the Ethiopian constitution. But according to the Ethiopian constitution, you don't have the right to collude with an enemy hostile state against your federal government. And that's a question also which needs to be considered in Mekelle. And adding to that, and which I think is possibly the most deepest, most troublesome aspect of the Ethiopian state itself, is the issue that the central government doesn't have the monopoly of violence in the country, which is the most key aspect of any state, is that it is only one, and that is the government, which should have the monopoly of violence in the country. In Ethiopia, that has never been the case throughout, well, as long as we have historical records. And that is the key, the fundament of what we are seeing today also, and what we saw in the 1970s and 80s, and what we saw earlier for that matter. Why is it so that insurgencies, violent armed insurgencies, are flourishing in Ethiopia throughout history? Regional insurrections against a central authority. How is that rooted? What is the level of distrust against the central authority? What is the level of distrust on Ethiopia itself as a country, as a notion, as an identity, which leads to successive insurgencies and relapse to war after a regime change or after a war is stopped? And you are constantly entering into new cycles of insurgencies with the aim of regime change in Ethiopia. And that is still haunting the country. And I don't, there are several historical, political, ethnographic theories which can explain this. But that's from an academic point of view. There are apparently no politicians who manage to fix it, to stop the endless cycles of wars and violence in the country. And from a pure, state theory, I'm not saying that should be applied on this case, but from a pure state theory argument, it is natural for the central government to crush regional insurrections which have an aim to topple the government itself, and certainly regional interactions which link up with foreign entities. But that has, again, always been the situation in Ethiopia. Regional insurrections have always had, interconnections to neighboring states or allies or other opponents of the central government of the country. So it's nothing unique what we do see in Tigray today or in Ethiopia today. It's just a sad observation. I don't have any answers to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Let's proceed to the next question. On the risks of multi-front instability with the NDF units withdrawn from Oromia and Amhara, leaving behind poorly trained local militia, Jawar warns of a looming collapse in internal security. If war with Eritrea does break out, in other words, do you believe Ethiopia risks simultaneous destabilization on multiple fronts? How might this affect Abiy's ability to sustain a northern campaign, Professor?
Well, is it stability today? Has it been stability over the last 3, 4, 5 years? I don't think, Jawar presents this that it will be something new. You have had the Fano insurgency ongoing intensely for 2, 3 years. You have had the OLA in Oromia. You have had other insurgents group elsewhere in the country. So there's nothing new to that. Will the security dimensions versus Addis Ababa significantly change because of a war in the north? That is the question. Is then this opening up for an actual takeover of central government by Fano or OLA or any other group, TPLF for that matter? I don't necessarily think that is so easy. And you have to remember that the central government in Ethiopia has been functioning all the way until the insurgents are in the palace. You have had war across your territory, but still a functioning government in Addis Ababa. Until the minute it collapses when the insurgencies are knocking on the palace door. Be that an internal coup in 74 or TPLF in 1991. So as long as the security situation doesn't deteriorate to the level where the federal government in Addis Ababa is collapsing, and you have a takeover of power, either from within or without, I don't see any big changes of the political context in the country if a war breaks out with Eritrea. Maybe even it can have a positive effect, positive effect in terms of, it's wrong to use the word positive effect, but it can have an effect of mobilizing Ethiopian nationalism again, as we saw in the 1998-2000 war as the best case, when TPLF, EPRDF at that time, before the outbreak of war, was severely criticized by all Ethiopian elites, but Tigrayans, of destroying the country and deconstructing Ethiopia, both politically and territorially and identity-wise. But as soon as the war on Eritrea broke out, you kind of circled the wagons and everyone was rallying behind the flag again. Deliberately also used by TPLF, EPRDF. Suddenly they spoke all on Ethiopianism, which they didn't do before 1998. So, you might have unintended or intended consequences of a war on Eritrea, which might pacify some of the internal conflicting dimensions. You might think, for instance, that some of the arguments of the Amhara nationalists or Ethiopianists will be pacified, because many of them have argued that Eritrea belongs to Ethiopia, and certainly Assab belongs to Ethiopia. So if Abiy goes after Assab, they will have a challenge to realign their opposition versus Addis in that regard, because he is then fulfilling an objective they themselves have argued for decades. So it's blurred landscape we are entering into. I'm not totally discarding the challenges, security challenges it will impose on the federal government when they are redeploying so many federal forces to the north. Certainly, it will create security challenges in Amhara, in Oromia in particular. But are they serious enough to threaten the lifespan of the federal government in Addis? Not so sure about that.
So you are, in other words, telling me that it's obvious in the Ethiopian context to function is the presence of such crisis here and there, so long as they don't touch palace. Okay.
As long as the palace is still standing, you will have a central government.
Okay. You previously told me, and you are repeating that today. Okay. Ethiopia's reported hosting of RSF, or the Rapid Support Force training camps, with alleged UAE backing, countered by Saudi, Egyptian, Eritrean support for the Sudanese Armed Force, or SAF, suggests the Horn of Africa is no longer a bilateral dispute, but a proxy theater. How does this UAE, Ethiopia, RSF versus Saudi Egypt, Eritrea, SAF alignment reshape the regional security architecture? And what thresholds of escalation does it introduce, Professor?
Yeah, and that's what we also clearly see and have seen over the last couple of years, for that matter, that the civil war in Sudan is obviously implicating and impacting the neighboring states. And the two most important neighboring states then in the north, Egypt, and in the south, Ethiopia. Both countries have, from a realist political view, natural interests in what's happening in Sudan. Sudan is a huge country with a huge demographic base, and a collapse, as we've seen there, do have spillover effects in the neighboring countries. So from that perspective, that both Egypt and Ethiopia are closely monitoring and following the situation and are protecting their borders against whatever is happening on the other side in the civil war is obvious. But it goes much deeper than that, much farther than that. And in the midst of this is Eritrea again as a key anchor. That Eritrea is aligned with SAF, and Egypt the same. And that Egypt has a strong interest to support Eritrea, which they have done through decades to destabilize Ethiopia, again, because of the Blue Nile and the Gur Dam. This is not something which have come up in the recent years. Egypt has supported the northern rebels, to use that term, against the central authority in Ethiopia due to the Blue Nile Dam prospects, long time before the construction of the dam itself. So it links very neatly then that Egypt-Eritrea alliance is strengthened, both because of what's happening in Sudan, but certainly what's happening in Addis versus both Sudan and Eritrea. It very much interlinks. That Ethiopia are on the side of RSF, to use that term, I think is probably most likely due to the interest of the Emiratis, the UAE, and their long-term support for RSF. And since the UAE is the strongest monetary and political backer of the Ethiopian federal government, Ethiopia is aligned on that side in the Sudan war, at least accused to be aligned with RSF in the Sudan war. But it is a bit blurred because Ethiopia and the Ethiopian National Defense Forces also have very strong individual relationship to the Sudanese army, SAF. But most of those relationships were handled by the Tigrayans in the military structure of Ethiopia. And hence we do see that Tigray and TPLF is also aligned with SAF, which overlaps then with their Zimdo with Asmara. So a potential war between Ethiopia and Eritrea will certainly be used also as a proxy war or be strengthened by those regional alliances we do see. Egypt, Saudi, Eritrea, and then UAE, Ethiopia. Possibly Somaliland is part of that axis as such. But they don't have the, monetary or otherwise capacity to be direct part of a proxy warfare, but a political supporter possibly. So it is a scary, most broad scenario. And of course you have Mogadishu, Somalia, but again, they are in their own chaos, but part of the other alliance against this somehow. Behind that, again, you have Turkey and other interests, as you know. So I think that what makes it even more serious. The path towards war between Eritrea and Ethiopia will involve so many other actors in alliances and as proxy interests, which makes it more difficult also to mitigate and to solve, be that during a war or after, so to say, picking up the relevant interests of that. And you will have a war theater in the Horn of Africa, which implicates all states, and the Sahel belt towards the Horn, which will be the biggest kind of geographical war theater we have in the world, if that explodes between Eritrea and Ethiopia.
So, in other words, you are saying that if a war breaks out between Ethiopia and Eritrea, it's not going to be a war between or interstate war. It would rather be a war among different allies, right?
It depends a bit on how you see it. Yes, certainly it will be. But it is a question how active in the actual warring these allied partners will be. I think it is doubtful that you will have boots on the ground, so to say, of Egyptian or Saudi troops in Eritrea fighting alongside Eritrean troops against Ethiopia. I don't see that coming, but a supply base, both with armament and other supplies needed and financial resources from Saudi, for instance, is much more obvious. I'm not ruling out that Egypt might send military advisors, maybe strengthening some of the air fighting capacities and capabilities, particularly anti-drone or drone warfare, that Eritrea might be supplied with that capacity. We might see, but fighting troops on the ground, I don't think that is likely in the near future. It depends again on how protracted such a war will be and the bigger interests of it. If it is if you're talking about the possibility of regime collapse or regime consolidation in both Addis and Khartoum and Asmara, that is a high stake war, which allies would look with a greater interest to put resources into that, either to consolidate or get regime change in these
Mhm.
three very, very important capitals in the Horn. And not only for the sake of the Horn itself, but certainly also for the control of the Red Sea and the shipping routes in the Red Sea. There are other actors also depending on that or wanting to control it, be that Israel for that matter, which are involved in the regional affairs now, but also US and China and Russia.
Okay, let me add one more related question. With Gulf rivalries intensifying, the UAE entering itself in Sudan and Ethiopia, while Saudi and Egypt pressure RSF supply chains, how do these external patronage networks recalibrate the political calculus of Addis Ababa and Asmara? Do they risk fusing local sovereignty disputes with proxy agendas, thereby hardening the path to de-escalation, Professor?
Well, I think uh, both sides or all sides in a forthcoming war would like to rally allies to support them in the forthcoming war, be that with supplies or troops or just political posture, political backing at the international level. It is extremely important for any country to have backers when they enter into a war. Look at Russia versus Ukraine. Russia is very dependent upon supplies from North Korea for munitions and political backing from China. Russia doesn't manage to wage the war on Ukraine alone. They are dependent upon allies. And certainly Eritrea will be 100% depending upon allies, and Ethiopia too, maybe to a bit lesser degree in the war. So that is the natural kind of dynamics of any interstate war, that you will have a broader field of interested state actors entering into that. conflict theater, and not with boots on the ground, but with military, but political, economic, and military advising roles. So I think that they are, both Asmara and Addis are factoring that in what's happening now, and bolstering them, making them more prone to stand their ground, so to say, not so interested to negotiate a solution if they feel they have a strong backing from rich allies. They can say, okay, if they are footing the bill, we can do the fighting. So ideally, it would have been a much easier world and a much easier conflict to solve if Eritrea and Ethiopia didn't have any backers, any proxies, any international links, that there were only those two individuals, Abiy and Isaias, who were calling the shots. No, it is not like that. There are other interests fueling into this. Why is Emirati supporting Ethiopia at the level they are doing with financial help and so on? Well, maybe some of the payback is what we see with the Benishangul base of RSF. What are the paybacks if there is a war on Eritrea? Well, certainly Dubai Port Management will be very interested to gain back control of Assab and Massawa. There are hidden interests here, economic interest, political, geopolitical, security interest, which are not the articulated objectives from either Asmara or Addis.
Okay, great. Ethiopia's renewed rhetoric on maritime access, particularly Assab, uh, has provoked sharp Eritrean responses. You might have been following closely to all those responses from the Eritrean side. Is the port cost now an existential security issue for Asmara? And if so, does it fundamentally recalibrate the escalation threshold between the two states, Professor?
If it is an existential issue for Asmara, you said, or for Addis?
No, for Asmara. For Asmara.
For Asmara.
Yes. No. My question is existential security issue. Security
okay.
issue. I say, yeah.
Security. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is an existential security issue for Asmara, the way the Ethiopian government has articulated their interest in Assab. But again, the Ethiopian government has been very skilled in what I call then constructive ambiguity. They do stress that they want access to Assab through negotiations. But at the same time, we also see other signals and other Ethiopian pundits alluding to a sharper strategy to reclaim Assab than through negotiations. So certainly that is strategic security threat to the Asmara government regime, those interests articulated by Ethiopia. And you can turn it around that the only reason Isaias of Werki is not giving Ethiopia access to Assab is because of his own, I would like to say stupidity, but let's say arrogance, political arrogance. The Eritrean people could benefit hugely to let Ethiopia use Assab with tariffs and import taxes, which the Eritrean people desperately need. And again, Assab is hardly of any significant use for the Eritrean people. Yes, there are some Afars in the neighborhood, certainly they will benefit. But it is Massawa, which is the main port for the Eritrean heartland and the Eritrean majority people. So it is purely out of arrogance that these two countries have not managed to come to an agreement of Ethiopia's long-term use of Assab. And I guess that is the hope for Ethiopia that Isaias Afwerki just turned 80 years, as you know. He doesn't live forever. Let's say he lives 10 more years then. And then you will have a regime change in Asmara. And then a new government in Eritrea will likely see their own self-interest to negotiate with Ethiopia over Assab. And I'm not talking here giving away sovereignty. There are several other international arrangements which can cater for the interests of Ethiopia when still Eritrea remains sovereign control of Assab.
Professor, do you think the situation in Eritrea uh, will be changed if Isaias passes away? What if he appoints, for instance, from his supporters loyal to the regime before he passes away? Yeah.
Well, the loyalists to the regime are all over 80 years themselves. So, it is a total generational collapse.
Mm,
Eritrean regime is a geriatric regime.
mm,
They are all more or less 80 years and above. I'm talking about the civilian part and the military part of that regime. It is destined to change. Does it change to the better? That is a different question. But the PFDJ/EPLF dominant structure is collapsing because of its own geriatric demographic. They are dead in a matter of 10 years. EPLF is dead. So what comes next? That is a good question. I think it might be worse for Eritrea than what is now. And then hopefully that instability will create some opportunities to negotiate a new settlement within Eritrean political elites abroad and in the country to move forward. But I think it is unlikely that the regime, as we know it today, will survive past Isaias Afwerki, because it is so personalized, the power he holds, and no other leader in the system as we know it today will hold that legitimacy and power internally, that authority to continue controlling all aspects of society. The successor to Isaias will immediately be met with questioning and challenges from the military leadership, economic leadership, and the civilian leadership of the structures to be in Eritrea today. No one will wield the authority Isaias had to continue this one-man rule as it is today. So hence, yes, the regime will collapse. What will come out of it? A military dictatorship? General Philippos taking control? Possibly. Will he manage to negotiate some kind of transition to civilian rule? I won't bet my money on that, but he will be challenged by other generals and other segments of society. Again. So if Ethiopia is a bit patient, the Eritrean regime will collapse under its own weight. And then Ethiopia can enter to pick up the remains, so to say, to negotiate whatever they feel is relevant when it comes to Assad. But I'm not sure Abiy is that patient that he can wait 10 years, possibly even 15 years for Isaias to die.
Okay, if Assab, as you mentioned, is existential for Eritrea, existential security threat for Eritrea, does Ethiopia's rhetoric amount to a direct challenge to Eritrean sovereignty? And how might that shape Eritrea's military calculus, Professor?
Well, I think we have touched upon most of that already. In the sense, yes, it does challenge Eritrea. But Ethiopia is again skillful to stress that they need peaceful access, negotiated access, long-term agreements, mutual agreements. But at the same time, they are clearly signaling that if we don't get that, we cannot be patient forever. So, okay, what comes next? Ethiopia cannot get an international justification on landlocked countries' right to access to sea, and hence a military intervention to capture Assab, that will not stick. Because the landlocked countries doesn't have the right of military taking control of the closest seaport. It is the right to negotiate access.
A sovereign country, yeah.
Yeah. So, but then Ethiopia now is not arguing that Eritrea is a hostile country because they don't want to let them use Assab. They are arguing Eritrea is a hostile country because there are Eritrean troops on Ethiopian territory today, which the Ethiopian government say they shouldn't be. And that the Eritrean government is funding armed insurrections in Ethiopia today, which the Eritrean government should not do. That's the reason for the war to come, not because they want Assad, but a consequence of such a justified right to self-defense might be that they also get Assad if it is a regime change war.
Do you think, if so, do you think Ethiopia would stop there soon as the Eritrean troops leave the border?
That's a question, and I think that's what also ex-TPLF leaders accuse Meles for when he stopped the Ethiopian offensive in early June 2000, when the Eritrean defense lines collapsed and Ethiopia won the 1998-2000 war. You did have many senior officials in the TPLF side who wanted at that time to go all the way to Asmara to topple Isaias. Meles said no, and later you got the TPLF split, yeah, as you remember. We hear today that senior officials in the party over the last year and a half of the government, of the Ethiopian government, and I think even Abiy himself on one or two occasions said that, if a new war breaks out, that will be it. It will be a regime change war in Eritrea, threatening Isaias Afwerki then to comply to Ethiopian demands. I don't want to speculate if that is the case, but I think that depends on a lot of other factors. How strong the Eritrean defense will be. It will be strong. Eritreans are viewing this, even though the absolute majority of Eritreans despise and hate Isaias Afwerki, they are at the same time nationalists, and they will view an Ethiopian attack as an attack on Eritrean sovereignty, which all Eritreans are in favor of. So sadly, I think they will rally the base, so to say, in such a war and fight to neath and tail to defend the motherland. But then it is how protracted such a war will be, what kind of resources are put into it by allies. If it is only a number game, a war of attrition, well, Ethiopia 130 million, Eritrea 2 million plus. That will, of course, indicate who will win a war of attrition, if it is that easy. I don't necessarily think it is that easy, because a lot of dynamics will be put in motion, and also certainly within Ethiopia, as you said, TPLF, Tigray, Amhara, Oromo, contingencies here will also impact Ethiopia's war capabilities and capacities, in addition then to the regional dimensions, as we talked about.
Is that necessarily true that population size really matters either to defeat or to be defeated?
Not necessarily, but if it is a protracted war of attrition, as we do see in Ukraine-Russia war, if it is a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia where you lose 10,000, 20,000 troops each month, which has been the normal during the two recent wars between the two countries, you can just calculate how long Eritrea will have a mobilizing capacity to lose 10,000, 20,000 troops a month. versus Ethiopia, if that will be the type of war we're talking about. And it seems to be a massive mobilization of troops, but the additional effect is the air capacities, the drone warfare capacities, which, at least on the paper, Ethiopia also has the upper hand with their air force, which have been strengthened radically over the last 2 years, and certainly also the drone force capacity of Ethiopia. We know that Eritrea has also received some supplies on that, but I would believe that is a much lesser degree than what Ethiopia has built up over the last 2 years. So, but again, I take all precautions to say that I know the fighting capacities and spirits of Eritreans. It will not be an easy walkover, but it will be at a terrible, terrible cost of the Eritrean people and also for the Ethiopians, obviously.
Let's come to issues related to Tigray. In relation to the alliances that we were discussing and mentioning, so within this shifting matrix, how does Tigray's political and military posture intersect with broader regional competition, Professor? Does the UA-Ethiopia alignment risk isolating the TPLF, or could rivalries paradoxically create strategic breathing space for it?
Well, TPLF is linked into the broader alliances themselves through the Trimdo alliance with Asmara. And then Eritrea's backers, be that Egypt, Saudi, or others, will also be the indirect or direct backers of TPLF in this conflict to come. If TPLF Tigray decides fully to side with that side in the coming war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. It appears to be so now, but again, it might shift also in Tigray. So I think, even though I haven't seen any statement from the Debretsion or the leadership of TPLF or of Tira, Tadesse Werede, on, as I've argued earlier, what is the strategic objectives of Tsimdu? It is clear what the tactical objectives are, but it is unclear for me what the strategic objectives of Tsimdu are as viewed from Mekele. That is not being articulated. Why are you doing this? Is it to secede from Ethiopia, to establish an independent Tigray? Is it to join Eritrea in some kind of confederation or federation? Is it to create the Tigray-Tigrinya Republic? Is it to create Greater Tigray? What are the strategic objectives of Tsimdu? Because the risks are so high and the cost will be so devastating for Tigray in terms of human suffering, that I think the Tigrayan people deserves to know what the long-term strategic objectives are, not only the tactical short-term aspects of it. Because you are putting all of Tigray again up for destruction. And massive killings of civilians and Tigrayan men and women being recruited into the security forces. And they deserve, and their families and their mothers and fathers deserve to know, what are you fighting for long-term wise.
Who do you expect to speak about the objective of Zumdo, so long as there is no officially declared political alignment or government-to-government alignment? This is what I know so far here. Though I don't know what really may be behind the curtain. Yeah.
Well, who are the power holders? Who are the authority in Mekele? They should speak about it.
Okay, let me make it clear. As to them, Sumdo is so far all about people-to-people relationship, nothing else. Yeah, this is what they tell us officially. So, who do you expect?
But they should tell us. They should tell you the full story, not only the 10% of the story. Because it is not only about people-to-people reconciliation. I 100% support people-to-people reconciliation between Eritreans and Tigrayans. I've been working for that for years and years. I've been written articles on it. I've been working with researchers from Adigrat, from Mekele, on projects to support that people-to-people reconciliation and let the politicians get away from that. But this time, it is not only people-to-people reconciliation, it's a very much politically steered and controlled Zimdo. And what are the political interests from the elites then in Mekele and Asmara on this? We know it is more. Say it. Not to me. It's not my business, but say it to the Tigrayan people. Because it is surely your business. You are the ones who will fight and die for it. Not me.
Okay. What about this, Professor? Could external rivalries inadvertently empower Tigray by creating leverage against Addis? Or is isolation the more likely trajectory?
Well, that depends on what is happening on the ground now.
Mhm.
So far, and I can fully understand that viewed from Tigrayan political decision makers, that you have been standing still since the signing of the Pretoria Agreement, more or less. You haven't had the necessary movement forward in terms of IDPs, for what that matter, for the return of territories, restoration of full capacities and capabilities of Tigray governance structure, the full representation of Tigray at the federal level, economic growth, humanitarian considerations, employment, host of political issues, very essential political issues for the Tigrayan people, have been left unattended, have been standing still, as you say, in isolation from what's happened elsewhere in Ethiopia or internationally. That imposed isolation, because it is not a self-elected isolation, it's more or less an imposed isolation, needs to be broken. I fully understand that. It appears to me then that the political authorities in Tigray have chosen to side then with Eritrea to break out of that impasse, to move forward one way or another. But the consequence of that is, in all likelihood, a new war with Addis Ababa. I don't know if it had been possible, because I don't have the insights into discussions, the detailed discussions, the confidential discussions between Mekele and Addis over the last 2-3 years. We hear more of that being exposed, so to say, by the losing side of TPLF, by Getachew Reda and Tzadkan and other old TPLFites who have changed side. But it comes back to what we discussed a bit earlier, the view of the trust, the building block of social cohesion at the Ethiopian level, the trust between people to people and the trust between central authority versus regional authorities. That trust, that social contract at all levels of state is not there. And hence, you don't think as a Scandinavian social democrat that you always consent to orders issued from the capitals in Sweden or Oslo or Copenhagen, because we are all together and we all have basically the same objectives of politics. That is so far from the realities in Ethiopia, where you don't have a social contract between federal government, regional government, and all the way down to the grassroots, to the individual level for that matter. Why is it so that there is hardly any people in Africa, and I've been working in 12 states, where more or less everybody has or want to have a Kalashnikov stacked away somewhere in their home because of the deep distrust you have against all above authority. But at the same time, you also you are an extremely hierarchical structured society where you also obey orders from above, usually, but then you don't trust it at all. You always have a backup, exit, whatever strategy. So I think it sticks so much more deeper than what we see on the surface in the rhetoric between Meckel and Addis. That's nothing new. It's been there for centuries, and it's replaying itself over and over and over again. How many farmers, peasants of Tigray have been sacrificed for wars over the last 200 years? It's tremendous. I just saw some demographic statistics. If you hadn't had wars in Tigray the last 200 years, you would have been a population of 50 million or so. I don't know if it is any truth of that demographic statistics, but Tigray has sacrificed so many of its youth every decade for wars instigated or defended by the political elite. So I don't know. I don't have any answers on how you should break out of that. I just see it as a deep, deep tragedy. And it's not only Tigray, it is also the other people of Ethiopia, but particularly Tigray. And I think that's because of your geographical location, but also because of your historical prominence. There is a lot of issues playing into that. But the fact also that Tigray has always been the gateway to proxies, be that Ottomans, French, Italians, Mahdists, whatever. You have always been at the gateway, and you have always had elites in Tigray which have allied with these foreigners to gain control of regional authority, or maybe even the palace in at the center. So the historical dynamics between Tigrayan elites and territory versus the broader world has always played a prominent part in how the political elites in Tigray have positioned themselves versus the center in Addis or Shoa earlier. And that is still being used. And how to settle this permanently is an open debate, in a sense, an open scholarly debate. If you view Ethiopia as an empire, or if you view it as a multinational state as such.
But with regard to the relationship between the federal government and the Mekelle, you said that you didn't get the real picture in the past 2 or 3 years, right? Why couldn't you understand from the letters you mentioned have been written by Dr. Debretsion to different parties or the international community, including the African Union? Is that really that much difficult to understand, especially taking the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement? It's an open secret, so far as I know. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you might say that. Now you have other former leaders of TIRA and TPLF who says the otherwise, that it's the Bretsion's TPLF who have been neglecting the implementation of Pretoria. I don't think it is black and white. I think, yes, on some elements, the main responsibility rests in Addis Ababa for the lack of implementation. 100% agree on that. But on other issues of it, it might also be the responsibility of authorities in Tigray.
Quite true.
But again, the Pretoria Agreement is just a cessation of hostilities agreement. Pretoria Agreement is not a peace agreement. It's not a comprehensive peace agreement on how to move forward. It is a temporary cessation of hostilities agreement. It's nothing in the long term. That is the key issue. You should have immediately started negotiating a comprehensive peace agreement. You didn't do that. Neither side did do that. And AU has failed from A to Z in all its obligations. So, you can share blame to anyone involved in this process. Also the so-called international observers, be that EU, US side of it. So I think, it is so much more deeper than the Pretoria Agreement. That's what I'm trying to say. And I don't know the insights into that, in how it has been phrased and communicated and maneuvered, both from Mekele and from others. The official statements tell you 20% of the truth. 80% is still hidden.
One more question, just to be able to manage our time, Professor. Thank you very much indeed, by the way, for all the insights that you are sharing with my audiences. So TPLF's warnings of an implementation deficit in the Pretoria Agreement highlight fragility in the peace process. Right? Has the African Union-led mediation architecture reached its structural limits, and what enforcement or verification mechanisms are indispensable or essential to sustain credibility and prevent the agreement's collapse, Professor? My last question.
Yeah. If it has reached its limits, well,
you told them.
I might be too critical to AU. I must say that. But look upon the deteriorating security landscape across Africa. Look upon the backsliding, the autocratization of African states. Look upon the sustained, continued, and increased human rights abuse and infringement of free press, free speech across many African states. What is African Union doing in this regard? I don't think they will get grade A on any significant policy issue ever for the last 20 years. But that's my outside perspective, and as I warned from day one, from just after reading the Pretoria Agreement, it was quite obvious that the monitoring capacity was way too weak, way too insignificant to play the determining role it should have played. 12 EU observers part-time going back and forth. That's nonsense when it comes to the biggest war on African soil for decades. And you have 12 individuals with a very weak mandate to oversee the implementation of this cessation of hostilities agreement, and no follow-up team to negotiate a comprehensive peace agreement. So that was a folly from day one. And I don't know who's to blame on that. It was that was what they negotiated, and I think clearly that the Ethiopian government didn't want a strong AU oversight function, and AU itself didn't want it because it is too awkward. When it is Ethiopia we're talking about, AU has always shied away from Ethiopian politics because it is the host country. They have to be very careful on how to thread in Ethiopia. And the internationals who were the main architect of the agreement, Kenyatta and the US Special Envoy, Mike Hammer, well, they didn't really have maybe even the interest or the possibility to design a stronger monitoring component. Certainly, US had no interest to be institutionally involved. Neither EU, of course, but EU was very weak part in this. And Kenya couldn't promote itself, so to say, as a monitoring partner when it was up to AU to design the framework formally of it.
Thank you, Professor Shettle Trumbull, once again, as usual, for sharing your insights this way with my audience. And if you have anything that you would like to say, whatsoever it may be, a message or something that we should have discussed.
Just that we all, no matter who we are, where we are, should work our utmost to try to prevent a new conflict to erupt. And those of us, or those of you who are religious, you should really start praying for divine intervention to prevent the outbreak of this conflict to come.